All right. Ben Taylor, welcome to the pod, my friend. How are you?
I'm great. I mean, our basketball season's over, so I'm just in. It's like the summer of. Did you ever watch Seinfeld? It's like the summer of George. That's what my life.
Yeah, I watched a lot of Seinfeld. I'm an official old. Okay, I'm an official old, so I know about Seinfeld. It's weird when you have like cultural. Okay, you want to talk about Seinfeld? So when I went to college, and again, dating myself here. It was like during the heyday of the Thursday night, I guess it was Friends and then Seinfeld sort of
Frasier
thing.
was afterwards, I think.
Yeah. So then in the dormitory, there was one main area downstairs where there was like a pool table and a TV and this and that. And I was amongst the contingent of the basketball fans, but mostly basketball. That was mostly my thing growing up. And we would be trying to watch something else. And then the hordes would come down. And we tried to battle them for a few weeks to not give up access to this TV because some people had TVs in their room, some people didn't. You know, this is like early, what's this email thing? Sort of thing going on. Again, dating myself severely here. And I tried to fight them off for the longest time. But I mean, I think this is that's probably like the last time there was this cultural, everyone tuning in at a particular time to watch a particular show.
Yeah, maybe outside of live sports. I mean, maybe that's the
right.
compelling part of what live sports have, and some HBO series. They've managed to like cultivate that a little bit, I think, with the Sunday night time slot, which I've tried to get into more in the last couple of years. I like to binge watch things. I don't like to wait. One, I like to get in the flow of the show, but two, honestly, Kevin, I just forget what happens the week before. I'm like, and they have those little recaps at the beginning, and it does like a good job. But 2 minutes into the episode, I'm like, wait, who's this person? Why is he asking about this? Anyway, this show has gotten off to a great start. You're talking about basketball. I'm here to talk about. Have you warned your listeners that I can't talk about football before 2016? I can't even name a player.
Nothing important has happened other than Patrick Mahomes since then, so we don't really have to.
Yeah, I've seen him. I have a
vague feel. Trust me, they would rather hear about, Game of Thrones and how to avoid spoilers on the Sunday night television. Succession, never seen Succession, so you're watching the Succession, I assume. Then
I've seen the Succession. Yeah, I've seen.
Okay. I saw a couple of clips, and I was like, I don't know. I guess having a show full of characters that you don't like none of them are likable, is now the new formula. I guess in some way.
This is the brilliance of this show. They somehow get you. The first few episodes did not work for me, and then I had to change my mindset. And I said, "This is satire, and it is what Arrested Development would be today. If they had to make Arrested Development, it's this show. It's more serious. But if you actually read every line, every single line delivered in that show, I think might be comedic genius when you view it that way. So that's how I get into the show. But no, I can't watch those programs and then wait. Kevin, when I wait a whole year for the next season, I don't even remember the names of the characters. So I wait until the end. I did not watch Succession until season 4 was live rolling, and then I catch up. I did the same thing with Game of Thrones. I'll probably do that with the next show. What are we going to talk about today?
I don't know. What are we going to talk about? Okay, so we'll talk mostly basketball here. I'll quiz you on some.
I came here to talk about football. We're talking about
NFL
basketball
stuff here. Well, you invite me on your podcast, and then you're also a solo podcaster, which I appreciate. And then eventually gave up. So you gave up the.
Well, okay. To be fair, one of the hardest things, we do so much work that never makes it to the light of day, that I realized having pods that just riff off the work we're doing. I mean, you make a 10-minute video and undoubtedly 6 really fun things get cut. A bunch of ideas don't get into it. You're scouting all these other things. So I realized solo podcasting in that manner is almost impossible. So I didn't actually intend to completely give up solo podcasting. It just happened organically, because now I'm like, why solo podcasts when you can have other people to talk to? It's much easier.
Yeah, I'm only doing a little bit of Q&A on the pod. You know what I was using the podcast for, the solo podcast, too much in the past, is that I was too lazy to write things up, which is a clearly superior format to putting out information than when it's delivered in a solo sort of podcast. So I would, talk about what happened during the week and these advanced stats and other stuff. It's I should really just be writing this up. So I'm trying to replace a lot of that. and write things up for posterity's sake, of course, which will be referenced, generations into the future.
No one can read anymore. That's a lost art.
That's why I like to put a lot of visuals, so then you don't have to read. Everything is worth like 1,000 words, basically.
All right, let me throw an idea at you. I've said this on many podcasts before, probably. I work in basketball. Basketball, to me, sits at the most interesting intersection of how to use data, because there's a lot of stuff going on. We measure a decent number of things. It's not one-on-one. There's 10 players on the court, which is a lot, but it's not too many. So it kind of sits in this middle space of like, analytics can help us, data can help us quite a bit, but they can't really tell us everything. And the idea of like solving the sports, oh, this player is worth this many points and this player is worth that many points, it's still very difficult. A sport like baseball, which of course Bill James and everything started, I think, the sort of popularity and revolution of using all this. Baseball has this feel of like, okay, there's very many discrete events that I can be very confident about. And it sits on one end of the spectrum. And football, apologies to hockey and soccer and other big sports, those are the three I'm using right now. Football sits at this other end where you're just like, all right, I'm watching football. And there's like, well, I'm sorry, there's like 60 plays a game, and there's 16 whole games in the season. And like one quarter of the time you're in prevent, and another quarter of the time you're in jumbo. At the one time you're looking for 2 yards, and another time you're looking for 17 yards. There are special teams plays. Like it seems like it's on the other end of this spectrum of how can we use data to really figure out what's going on and make informed decisions. And then at the end of the day, I mean, when you get into like who's the best quarterback of all time, I don't know. It seems much harder in football. It seems much fuzzier.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. Well, actually, this is probably part of the kind of macro points that I would want to talk to you about with your work. I mean, for the work that you do, I would say maybe like Zach Lowe's type of work there, where it's like a smart, informed, almost for him more than you, although him also, it's almost like an intuition about these different types of, because analytics is not like, it's not, it has to be a total number sort of thing. Most of it is just knowing how not to overreact to certain things, how to appreciate during certain sample sizes, how to have this kind of world view of things. So when you have that, I think you can combine that much easier with the type of film work that you guys are doing, because I mean, the broadcast copy has everyone on there. The concepts are, I mean, it could be somewhat opaque what teams are doing, but it's really kind of just all out there for us to see if you really want to see it. Whereas in the NFL, which I think can bring value to numbers, it can also makes the numbers, but it makes numbers type analysis less valuable as a standalone, but it may make it more valuable in contrast to what teams are doing with film, because when you have people who are informed, not inside the locker room, drawing up the actual plays, but people who understand football, they'll have like 3 different opinions about what's going on a particular play, where I don't think it's that same range of overconfident, educated guessing going on than there is in football. So in some ways, like, you can build a more complete picture there through the NBA than what you're doing with the NFL. And I think that makes total sense.
Yeah, I mean, just based on what you said, the fact that they stop every play in football and have a private secret meeting about what everyone is going to do and then start up another play, right? It makes analyzing those plays incredibly difficult. And then you hear about these anecdotes. You hear about, like, I don't know how famous it is amongst your listenership, but, you hear about like Ed Reed talking about tricking Peyton Manning. Have you seen this?
Yeah. That's the one where he kind of like peels out and twists back to the outside.
Yeah. So he claims, and Ed Reed is absolutely amazing. I have heard Belichick and Brady gush in documentaries over some of the things that he's done. He claims that he knew they were going to play Indianapolis in a few weeks, and Manning, I think it's an out route. Right. He's like, oh, they like to run this play with Marvin Harrison or Reggie Wayne or whoever it was back then. Once again, all my references will be from the aughts and the 90s. And
luckily
the 80s.
For you, we have Marvin Harrison Jr., who will be in the NFL soon enough. So
are you being serious? Really?
He's going to be the number one receiver taken next year. I think he's ready to come out. So yeah.
Okay. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. Watching everyone's kids get drafted into the NBA is a thing I'm already experiencing.
Athletic genes help. Genes
Yeah.
help to get into pro sports. But
It turns out they make and having, parents with experience in the sport and money and resources and all that. Anyway, so the idea here is that Reed says Manning likes to run this route. I can't remember if he thought he tipped it in any way, but he claims he deliberately plays the coverages differently in the previous weeks against receivers to make it look like he will bite on this tell. I think he basically thought Manning had a pump fake tell, and so because of the nature of the out route and where Reed is positioned as a safety, he bites on the pump fake, pretends to go one way, pretends to bite, and then flies over the other way and intercepts it. Now, to your point about the all 22 film and like what you see on a broadcast and things like that, in basketball, we get to see the whole play. It's a flowing play. We don't have these crazy like stoppages between every possession. In the old days, we didn't have that. The camera was like a little too zoomed in and you couldn't always see everything on the court. But when you're watching that play live, I might have actually watched that game live. It just looks like Manning throws it to nowhere right to Ed Reed. That's the broadcast. You're like, why would he do that on the broadcast? So it's very easy, I think, to come up with interpretations of that without seeing the full picture of the field, without understanding the history of the route, of like, that was the worst pass Peyton Manning has ever thrown. Why did he throw it right to Ed Reed? When the reality is, if you buy the whole story, that like that's one of the smartest, most brilliant sort of chess matches you probably can have between a high-level defender and a high-level quarterback.
yeah, I mean, I think Reed is a good example of someone who just blows up any attempt to try to use your knowledge about what's going on. I remember, I think it was Dominique Foxworth talked about when he eventually was playing for the couple of players. I believe he played with Reed also, that it was kind of like, okay, here's the play, here's the design, but Ed Reed's just going to do what Ed Reed does. Okay, so he's supposed to do something, and the coaches know that like he's generally supposed to do something, but he's just going to do what he wants to do, what he feels like is the right thing to do on this play, use his instincts. And you as a player have that in mind, that he might be doing something completely different than what you think he's going to do. And that's also when it comes to the NFL. It's like, not only do you have, like, you don't know what the play is, but within these plays, now there are choices that the players are designated with. Of course, the quarterback can choose who to throw the ball, but now it's very common that on the defensive side, there are choices that are decided on whether or not, like zone, not only zone coverage, but you're mixing and matching what's going on there. Receivers have option routes where they're going one way depending upon one coverage, or going one way depending upon another coverage. So yeah, the funniest thing for me, and what I like to sit back with the popcorn and is when people are talking about a particular play, and then these former players will be contradicting each other on what is actually happening. And then you start to realize, and you're yelling at me as if I don't know what's going on. Look at these guys are like Pro Bowlers who don't know what's going on.
Yeah. No, that's where I see certain similarities with basketball. One of the kicks I've been on in the last couple of years is the use of zone defense in basketball. And even so zone was not allowed in basketball for decades. And then they allowed it again, but no one really used it a lot in the NBA. And now you're starting to see slightly more complex applications. And maybe more importantly, within like a traditional man-to-man defense in basketball where everyone is marking someone one-to-one, there are always moments in the possession where like one or two players zone up two or three other players, or the ball's on one side of the court and they say, okay, these two guys are going to be responsible for everything that happens over here. So you have this like hybrid zone read and react thing going on defense. On offense, because it's a very flow driven sport, you have those kinds of offensive concepts that you just talked about, where it's like you want to read what's happening on the floor, and depending on how the defense is playing it one way, you may cut the other way. A screen is set over here, I can use the screen and go left, I can use screen and go right, or I can flip the screen. The screener, in this case, analogous maybe to a blocker or something on the offensive line, like he can change the angle to help react to how the defense is playing. So the sort of convergence of like a ton of zone, read, react concepts that empower players. That's something that's really interesting to me to see across sports. I think soccer has had a lot of that as well. And the other big thing, just while I'm on this is rant here, spacing, just the use of spacing has been revolutionary in basketball, but I think you've also seen it in football where trying to remember what season it was. I want to say off the top of my head, like 2009, I went to a bar to watch opening day of the NFL on a Sunday. And you're sitting around and everyone's doing, everyone's drinking the beer at the local watering hole and they got their jerseys
beer.
on.
They're like, I love the beer.
Yes, this is the beer. Yes. That's what they drink when they watch football, right? They eat the wings and they drink the beer. Yes. And I think it was the Patriots game. They played the Jets, and the Jets fan behind me could not stop talking about how they had a street ball offense that was going nowhere. They're like, this is just flag football. What is up with these 4 wide receivers and empty backfields? And he's in shotgun every time. You can't be in shotgun every time.
It's not a serious offense.
Yeah, no, but just thinking about like, Texas Tech, Mike Leach, the so-called spread offense, and just the proliferation of these ideas across sports has been really interesting to me to see, where you have read and react, optionality in the offense, and then how much space can we use? Because it turns out in sports where humans can run and cut, the more space we have, the harder it is to defend. This is not what we were going to talk about today, but I'm just
we're going. But I do think it's interesting. It hasn't become a basketball type of offense in the NFL, clearly, as we talked about, because of how well everything is diagrammed. But players are more empowered than they were in the past, and I think that also hints to some of the difference, because I've been watching a lot of soccer recently, and I think it's the same as basketball. Like, you could trade for someone, they could just come in. The coach could maybe not even have talked to them before. And they could just be like, okay, just go out there and just go out there and do something. Like, you'll kind of get it. You get it, right? It's like, I don't have to explain everything to you. Like, there'll be some things you're not going to get, but you can kind of get it, which is the same as soccer. Whereas in the NFL, other than maybe a running back, you just hand the ball to, and they know to run away from people who are trying to tackle them. You can't really do that in the same sort of way. So, yeah, I mean, that's part of it. But I think sample is also like the huge thing. And you hinted on that a little bit on what you're doing there. So maybe we got to back up for a second here. So let's okay. We really got off the rails. And I know you're I should have known that going into this, that we needed guardrails.
Yes, I'm sorry.
we did guardrails, because I need guardrails. You need guardrails a little bit. Maybe that's why we like the solo podcast, because then we can just go where we want.
There's no one there to tell us we can't just talk about whatever we want for one very long sentence. Okay, bring us back in.
So let's start. Okay, let's rewind all the way back here. This is my guest, Ben Taylor here, Thinking Basketball. I just looked at this, 516,000 subscribers. I remember back when you were a young little pup there, just starting off that subscription. Everything else got covered. Why don't we rewind back to how you got into even looking at the NBA in this sort of manner, and then we could kind of build up towards maybe some of these other concepts that we're talking about here.
Well, I think it's part and parcel with everything we've been rambling about for the last 15 minutes or whatever. Basically, the way I always watch basketball, no matter how much data you use, the game in front of you, the context of the film, the things the players are doing, that's everything. And in fact, if it's not worth stating, I mean, I've said this a million times, I'll say it again. Most of stats are just measurements. They're just counting up the things that you know are important from watching the game. How do you know it's important? Because you have contextual understanding of the sport. If you ask someone who had never seen a football game to come in and chart some really healthy stats to figure out who the best players are, they probably couldn't do a very good job of that. Who knows what they would land on? That might be an interesting experiment to run one day. Would they land on the player who scored the most touchdowns? Would they even know what a touchdown is? They would just, the last player who had the ball when they ran into the end zone before they do the dance. Yeah. Do they still do dances? Is that outlawed?
No, I think that's back, right? Yeah, it's back. It's back.
I hope so. Boy. So that's basically the short of it, is that the film side, or just watching the game, had always been something I had done in conjunction with stats. And the idea of like should we make a podcast or should we write something down? Should we make a video or should we write something down? Every time I wrote something down, I couldn't actually point to the play on the court that I was talking about. So I'd always wanted to do more film. So I just started pointing to more plays on the court. And there are some cool people who do the same thing in the football space as well. And I think it really pops when you can get to slow something down, put it under a microscope, and say a big one for me. Again, all my old references. The Giants sort of pass rush defensive line blitzing scheme that Bill Barnwell outlined in the 2012 Super Bowl, the second time they beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl. Like, just seeing the pictures and the clips, you go, oh my, okay, that makes sense. That does something to me. Just writing it in words, you lose that a little.
Well, okay, so how much of when you're watching something is it diagnosing what may be missing in some type of metric that you would look at? Obviously, there's lots of things maybe missing in what metrics other people's may be looking at. And how much of it is saying, I'm looking at some sort of, I don't know what it may be, some sort of on-off stat, some sort of defensive stat. And then I'm realizing, wow, this is like not, this player is pretty impactful. Let me go and look and try to figure out what may be going on that I'm missing. Is this correct or not? You know, how does that whole process work? Because with the film side, I do think there's a lot of good film analysis in the NFL, and I do think there can also be poor film analysis in the NFL where the conclusions don't align with the data. And I guess my analytical instincts tell me that that's probably overconfident when people are doing that, and they're saying, no, trust me, look at these 4 plays. You know, and I'm just saying that's great. Maybe those 4 plays are doing what you're telling you, are saying what you're saying, but I remain less convinced, I guess, than when we have the things coming together in a logic kind of like cohesive manner.
Yeah. Okay. So if I'm following what you're getting at, it's both for me. Sometimes I see someone with just some great sort of statistical number at a high level in basketball. It might be on off, or we have all these 1-number metrics that try to summarize your value. And you go, huh, that's interesting. I didn't think of that player as being really good, but also I haven't really closely watched that player. I haven't put them under a microscope. And so from there, that can guide you to take a deeper look and try to deconstruct what's happening. And in my experience, sometimes you see things and you go, oh, this guy's actually pretty good. He does this well. This is something that might not be tracked by the traditional box score, so is undervaluing him. He's really good at this within his team context, so he might be really valuable to his team. Sometimes you get that. Sometimes you go look under the hood and you kind of end up with the opposite conclusion. You go, oh, okay, my original intuition that the reason why no one's talking about this player is because he's not doing a lot of things super well. And now I'm grading against the statistics community. Now the analytics guys are going to come after me because he looks really good by these top numbers, but
yeah.
I'm
vicious.
looking at
most vicious.
Yeah, I'm looking at everything and I'm like, you know what? There might be noise, and there might be another thing that can happen is team context in basketball, because there's only 5 players on the court. If you have like the worst backup, some positions, they don't even have a backup. They're like, we just have the point guard, and then we're going to have someone else attempt to play point guard where you go to the bench. And so you do get these situations where you have a player who becomes a kind of analytics darling in the community. But when you go under the hood, you're like, I think if he changed teams, I think if something else happened here, you would not see the same analytics numbers, because there's a little bit of luck, there's a little bit of team context, and in different situations, he doesn't actually do things well enough to make a huge impact. So I think it goes both ways. The other side of the process question for me is a lot of times I'm watching stuff, understanding what's already been tracked. So take shooting in basketball as a really simple example. I don't need to worry about having my brain calculate how many threes Steph Curry made out of 500 attempts. So what I'm interested in is, how does he get into the attempts? How do teams take away the attempts? And in his case, there's some very interesting stuff with what happens downstream on the other side of the court because defenses are so worried about his shooting. That's what you get on film that isn't measured in the stats. When you go to the box score at the end of the day, you see who's the best 3-point shooter ever by percentage. And you look it up and it's like Seth Curry, his brother. And then Steph Curry is a little bit down the list. And so like you could scratch your head and from a naive perspective, you could go, okay, so they're the same. They're 3-point shooting percentage. They're both really good. They both take a lot of threes. They must have the same impact on the game. And it's like, well, one, that leaves everything else aside. But two, even when you watch the way they shoot threes, that's something you need to go to the film at a very basic level just to see, okay, they're not getting into the threes the same way. They shoot them from different spots on the court. One shoots them off the dribble more. That would be Steph. He shoots them off the dribble more than his brother, and so on and so forth. So to me, that's part of the process of understanding what stats are being measured and understanding what things around those stats I need to kind of fill in addition to just tracking things that, have never been tracked before.
Okay, so if you had the ability to just layer in, let's say if there's a misdiagnosis based upon some sort of catch-all, statistical number. Let's say you had, whatever AI. You got AI now.
Data from Star Trek. Is he allowed to
take it over? And you're able to build. Like, could you actually layer in enough contextual data into this to make that determination to really like improve what a purely analytics person is doing? Or is there no reasonable substitute for going ahead and watching? And even if you are going to go ahead and watch, you have to have some, talk about guardrails. You have to have some guardrails on yourself of making sure that you're kind of like tracking what you're watching in some sort of way, or else you won't be able to aggregate and weigh and figure out everything there. So how, like, could you build, if you could put your brain, let's say ChatGPT is doing all your writing and your and your vocals for your podcast, and then now also your brain has been taken over by AI. Could you just have a formulaic way of looking at this? I mean, let's talk about like off of the dribble. Hey, that's something you could just put into a model, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, ChatGPT I don't think knows where he is half the time, or she or it. But I think in theory, if you had the computing power and we had computers that were smart enough, if you got all the same inputs I got, I think you could drastically outperform the humans, just because basketball is such a sport with so much variability, such large samples. We're counting thousands and thousands of shots, and we're so prone. This is what I wrote Thinking Basketball, the book, about originally. We're so prone to just getting stuck in these narratives that come along to try to simplify everything for us. I mean, the way people talk about a basketball game, they talk about one or two plays at the end of the game when there were like 200 possessions in the game with a ton of actions taking place. And at the end of that game, Kevin, each team had scored 100 points. And at the end of the game, if one guy makes a shot or misses a shot, it will completely change how everyone talks about the entire game. And more importantly, to your question, how they talked about how the players in that game played. Like, making the final shot in basketball, because of the sample, because of the complexity, because of the variability, changes people's minds about how that player played retroactively. They're not really sure how he played until the end. And then if the shot goes in, let me tell you the 11 great things he did to swing the game for his team. If the other team makes the shot, I got to tell you why this star really choked. And we're going to put all the 9 things he did wrong under the microscope. Look at this turnover right here. What's he doing? Passing it to the other team for no reason. So I do think if we had the ability, in theory, we could. I also think we're a long way off, not just because of ChatGPT and AI modeling and things like that, but because think about all the inputs we've already talked about. Inputs like prior games, understanding what a scheme is, understanding what the coaches want to do, understanding players' tendencies. There's so many things happening. If we need like camera tracking data, not just to show us where the ball is and whether it goes in and who touched it last, that's great. But where's your head looking? what happened on the last play, and how is a player weighing that as a variable, and adding all of those things up, that some of which I probably can't even think of right now because it's a very exhaustive list. I think that's how you'd have to do it.
Okay, let's look at the flip side. You mentioned a little bit in the like what the I watch games, the game watcher community
The eye test.
the
Yeah.
eye test,
Yeah.
exactly. So winning or losing, that's good. That's obviously part of it. Like ball goes in versus ball doesn't go in, that's got to be a pretty big one there.
Huge.
On ball versus off ball value that's being added. What else am I missing here, and how would you weigh these different components
No,
as
those
far
are
as
big. Yeah, those are
yeah.
big ones. I think so did the team win? Are you watching the ball? Shot making and shot variability. And then I think the last big one is box score watching. So whatever's in the box score, and traditionally in basketball, it's like points, rebounds, and assists. You go look at that. Maybe you look up field goal percentage and you go, okay, I had a great game, 30 points and 60% from the field. Great game. So it's that kind of like soup. Some combination of that is used to pull and simplify the game. And even the eye test crowd. The eye test crowd, I think it's this way probably in most sports, but certainly in basketball, they still rely on these stats, right? They're just only using a few. They're like, no, I don't like using stats, but the score of the game is very important, and the number of points and the shots made and missed is very important. So, again, it's just another example of how intertwined these two ideas are, I think.
I mean, do you think the NBA has also become, and you did a video about how the new big man and being big isn't enough anymore. Like there has been a little bit of a decoupling between, let's say, like our instinctual idea of like a good basketball player, which is, let's say you're like playing 2-on-2 out someplace, and like the guy who just can't be stopped, right, who has the ball, versus someone who adds value in these other different ways. Has that also like muddied people's opinions when they, I don't know, even if they think of someone like Steph Curry, and Steph has had a bit of a bounce back from a strange dark period where people were viewing him with some failures there with the Warriors. But they look at Steph and they're going to look at LeBron. They're going to say, well, obviously, not that the LeBron isn't better than Steph anyway, but you know what I mean? It's like, oh, obviously that's the basketball player that we're talking about here. And I mean, is it fair to look at things that way? And maybe if it isn't even their value on the actual NBA game, to give a little extra credit for the guys who you just like think embody like basketball player a bit more.
I think that's the ball watching thing you mentioned,
Yeah.
where the other sort of, well, the end point, let's say, of ball watching is you reduce the game to a one-on-one game or a
Yeah.
two-on-two game in the park. So there is sort of a community that thinks, the best player is the guy who, if you roll the ball to him out at the 3-point line in a pickup game, he can go get you a bucket in the most diverse way. He's got great ball handling. He can shoot from all over the court. He can drive. He can post up. He has a little Jordan fadeaway. That's the best player. And of course, one, there's so many other things happening in a basketball game. And two, the actual effectiveness of that does not usurp just dunking the ball into the basket every time. So I have an example I always use is Shaq, who never needed to shoot outside 10 feet in his whole life because of 7'1" and 300 pounds and incredible athlete.
Other than when he unfortunately had to take free throws, but
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah, and that makes the point. He 50% free throw shooter, which is not good. He was much better shooting it near the basket than he was getting to the free throw line, which is rare for most players. By the way, most players, a free throw is the most valuable shot you can take. Where was I? So there's Shaq on one end of the spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum is a player named Earl Boykins, who was about 5'5" tops. Maybe was a couple pair of socks on. He was 5'5", and he had an NBA career. Muggsy Bogues is a similar example, but I actually think Earl Boykins was a more offensively centric player than Muggsy Bogues. Muggsy was about 5'3" as well. These are the shortest players to ever play, and Earl Boykins, like his shooting skill from all over the court and his ball handling and just change of directions. To be able to do this in the NBA for years against players who are 6'3", 6'7", 7 feet tall is extraordinary. So the ball skills, the one-on-one skills that Earl Boykins has traditionally are on the extreme end of the all-time spectrum. He's just not a great player or known as a great player because he was so small. Shaq, on the other hand, has almost none of those. And the question is like, who's better, Shaq or Earl Boykins? And the answer is, turns out dunking the ball into the basket is really, really good. And Shaq is like one of the best players of all time. And Earl Boykins is not even necessarily a player who would start on a lot of teams.
Well, okay, I'm interested in, let's talk again with topical sort of stuff here. So prospect evaluation. So you've been talking about this too. And of course, when we talk with Wemby coming into the NBA, 7'3", 7'2". I never really know. They got the shoes. Yeah. Can I? They do like they're doing like the dating profile thing where they have their shoes on when they got their heights.
So in football, they don't. I've used football for many years. They don't tell you the guy's heights in cleats. If you've never been down on the sidelines or played football, players wear cleats and they wear helmets. And they look like giant aliens when you are down there. Like a 6'6" offensive lineman in that outfit is like 7 feet tall, but they don't list him as 7 feet tall because the rest of us actually talk about height as, I know it's groundbreaking, Kevin. It's how tall you are where your head and your feet are measured. In basketball, they're like, we got to use the shoes to make everyone taller. That's so Wemby is like at least 7'3" barefoot, and we got a shoe height going right now of about 7'5".
Yeah, but what I think is interesting though, and this is a lowering your like downside or variance, and obviously he is extremely skilled. But even when we go back to someone like DeAndre Ayton going number one overall, there still is like a pretty heavy bias, I would say, in prospect evaluation towards the taller player, despite the fact, and I know we have Jokic now and, Embiid playing well and other things, but it kind of became a very like wing centric type of league. And definitely like if you found a player to fill that role, there was even some analytical findings. I think it was 538's different metrics kind of gave less credit to a great center than versus a great wing because of this like replacement value and how many of a team need for them. So do you think it's right though to still say we got to value this height, at least when we're talking about prospects coming in, because you can't teach height. It gives you some sort of baseline to do off everything. Or do you think there's maybe even a mistake and more teams should just be firing off shots at guys who could end up being failing at wing because of the value of the position and relative to others now?
Well, so I don't know if anyone loves height more than me. If you look at all the players who I think have the best careers, almost all of them are tall. So height is a huge deal. Height matters in basketball. Victor Wembanyama has a teammate who was drafted 7th in the draft. He's an 18-year-old kid, and he had a meteoric rise up the draft. And he put out a video measuring himself. And when I saw that tape measure, Kevin, at 6'6.5", I mean, I let out an audible yelp. I was like, yes, he's extremely tall. He has the perfect Parisian Pippen build. This is fantastic. Scottie Pippen for the football audience.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think they're going to get that one. But
and his name is Bilal Coulibaly. Anyway, height is huge. What I was getting at in that video, and it's very difficult to title when you have only you have a little character limit and a short time. We had so many other different titles for that video. The idea is big men who are these great prospects have almost always been considered the greatest prospects because as they come along in their formative years, their size gives them dominance on both ends of the court because the game used to be played much closer to the basket and it used to, in a sense, be a post-centric type of game. The league has done things and with the rules, the three-point line, the style of play to empower perimeter players more. I think perimeter players have, to some degree, always had an edge on offense because they have the ball a lot and they give a ton back on defense because big people are tall and can block your shot and take up more space defensively. So being tall was always like this huge deal. But when you go back and you look at all the mega prospects, and we did it on a Thinking Basketball podcast recently, almost every single one is a big man. And the difference between now and then is that the big men coming along don't play like that. So you have an increased skill burden. And that's the part where being big isn't enough. So people are really excited about Wembanyama's ability to ball handle and shoot for his size. But if you don't actually have the accompanying skill, meaning you can't actually get to the basket, you can't shoot very well, so on and so forth, then it doesn't do you any good. So compare that to all the other great young big men that came into the league. You weren't going, oh boy, Duncan is dusting people in the post. I wonder if he's going to start missing his hook shot in the NBA, right? It's a totally different thing. And that's where I think it's changed a little. The defensive side is still very much there. And in Wemby's case, he's an extraordinary defender already. But you mentioned Jokic. We also have Joel Embiid. These are Giannis Antetokounmpo. Big men are still dominating the game. They're just doing it differently. So they mix in a post game with a mid-range game with incredible shooting. I mean, both of those guys are great shooters. The skill and touch that they have from all over the court. I looked at my database yesterday for an upcoming project. In the last 10 years, no one has shot better from the mid-range than Nikola Jokic did in 2023. He made 61% of his mid-range shots. So the skill that these guys have today, ball handling and running pick and roll and everything included, is a very different thing than when Tim Duncan, David Robinson, Patrick Ewing, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, on and on and on, even Ralph Sampson, on and on and on, all these legendary big men in the NBA, those guys were playing in the post. So it was a different, the size value translation was different to me.
Do you think there could have even been a bit of a false signal of lower value for big men because there wasn't maybe understanding when these guys are young that they really have to be these completely skilled players? I mean, let's face it, if you're really, really tall and you're playing basketball, worrying about 3-point shots is maybe not something you would naturally do until you understand that it doesn't matter how tall you are. You have to worry about this eventually. And are we seeing maybe that rebound now because you have players coming out who have understood since they were, 10 years old that they have to be able to handle the ball and shoot 3-pointers and everything else, where that may not have been the case, 10 years ago, 10 years ago, or something like that. You had more players who have been entering who didn't have that skill development.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case, because what incentive do you have as a big man to go shoot a shot that the whole league considered inefficient? Right? This is it's always the elephant.
Well, you're
in
probably
the room.
hurting your results for winning games when you're a kid too, if you're doing that rather than just being tall and going in and scoring.
But it's like if you were a 35% 3-point shooter in the old days, league average is 35, 36% now. And that league average only includes the players that shoot threes. So that's still above average. It's still above the median player. But if you shot 35% from three as a kid in the old days as a big man, college, high school, and early NBA, whatever, and then you compared that to what you shot near the basket. We mentioned Shaq earlier. Shaq led the league in field goal percentage a number of years. He was always about 60% on those shots around the hoop. What coaches would tell you is, Shaq, why are you shooting a 35% three when you can get a 60% two? You're dragging your field goal percentage down. You're hurting the team. Stop doing this. And I think in that point in time, without the larger context and larger understanding and the way the game was played and the rules and everything, I think it made sense. To your point, now that we figured out how to unlock the value of that shot, now that we realize 3 points is actually one more point than 2 points, so your 35% three is 52.5% or whatever it comes out to on twos, we also get the holistic benefit of all the spacing that we talked about earlier that comes with that. That fundamentally changes the game. So why do we not have more possessions starting in the post? By the way, the post up is not dead. I've seen a lot of comments on that video saying, like, why are you saying the post up is dead? No, no, no. The post up is not dead. Aaron Gordon just took a bunch of people to school with post ups in the playoffs. It's just harder to have a hyper efficient offense built around the post in basketball because I think there's two big reasons. One, the post up takes a player and prevents him from seeing the whole court the way he would if he was facing the hoop at the top of the court. Two, dropping a player on the block actually eats up one of the open value spaces in the game. And so I think what basketball's realized is if we have the threat of cutting into an open value space from anywhere on the court toward the hoop, that's more valuable than sticking all our players right under the hoop and going, let's try to pass the ball to them. That's the big shift. So I think it's fundamentally harder once players know how to shoot and once they know how to attack space and once they know how to pass and move and all the things we're seeing in the sport now, to park players on the block and say, can you generate the same level of efficiency that I can get from a Luka Doncic pick and roll or something like that, from Steph Curry and Klay Thompson threatening to cut off each other for a three, and then if you mess up, one of them goes backdoor for a layup? Because what we saw against the Lakers at the end of Golden State's season this year is it turns out if Anthony Davis is just parked under the basket, you take away the backdoor for a layup thing. So now the guy on the perimeter doesn't have to worry about that, so he can guard the three, and the whole magic kind of fizzles out a little bit. So there's my answer.
Well, okay. Well, let's. I want to take this even for a little bit further out here because this is an interesting question I want to pose to you. I remember there was. This has been hashed and rehashed many times, but there was an article by Derek Thompson in The Athletic. It was a short little article, but it was kind of pointing to the fact that this kind of optimization thinking is ruining everything. You know, we've heard this before, right? But they're at least tried to have a hypothesis to it. Although I think it fell down a bit because it's just like accelerating what teams are trying to do anyway. But I would say the NFL always gets left out of these discussions because it's continuing to build in popularity. Maybe there was a little bit of a downturn and like the NBA is going to become the new thing around the Colin Kaepernick issue, and then everything that happened with the general play was down at that point in time. But generally, the NBA will be used as an example of this hyper analytical thinking, and optimization leads to a degree of just homogeneity where it's all threes and all inside. Teams all play the same, and it's not an entertaining watch because of that. What do you say to these charges? Is there any truth to it? Or is it all just maybe an overreaction to, the fact that we don't have the Warriors being the dominant team anymore? I think that probably has an effect because people love the dominant franchises also.
Yeah, I think there's a little truth to it. Actually, I want to come back to that question and interject just for a second.
Sure.
If part of the answer maybe is this idea that like in basketball, people feel more connected to the sport where there's a dynasty to either root for or against. And this goes back to Jordan's Bulls and perhaps even earlier in the 80s with the Lakers and the Celtics. But in football, they really seem to have cultivated this like parity rules all. Egalitarianism is the way to go. Like 10-6, that is the best. That's fantastic. You've won 10 out of your 16 games. And also next season, you could be 3 or 13. Sorry, Kevin, do they play 17 games?
Yeah, they
now?
do. I was gonna mention that, but I was like, I'm gonna let them cook. I'm gonna let Ben cook here for a while here, and everyone who's listening can just make that note in their head.
Yeah, so you know what I'm saying. But either way, right? This seems to be this idea that one sport thrives with parity, and the other, I'm gonna infer, struggles a little bit. And we're dealing with this right now because I do think we're in a period of parity compared to what we've seen in the past. And I do think it's creating sort of a playing field where you don't always have that juggernaut. The teams look more closely stacked together. And as a fan, does that create the same kind of narratives that get you really invested? I'm not sure. So I wanted to interject that before I go
Well,
to the.
I have a little bit of a theory on the difference between the NFL and the NBA there. I mean, if you look at like the most viewed TV shows for the year, like 48 out of 50 will be NFL games. I think people are just more invested in whatever happens to be happening that particular season. Whereas for the NBA, I mean, it's tough to talk about, we were talking earlier before we started about time. Like, I can't stay up to watch these West Coast games that are on TV, but it's nice to say, oh, it's the NBA finals. I haven't necessarily been paying the most attention this year, but I remember the Warriors were in the finals last year, and now I can watch it again to what's going on. But maybe there isn't as high of a threshold for familiarity in the NFL because people have been kind of paying attention as it's going along a bit more.
Yeah, no, this is the appointment viewing concept, right? Less is more. I don't know why they added a 17th game. It was just to throw me off on this podcast is why they added that 17th game. But
there might have been money involved in that also.
Yeah,
but, yeah.
Do you think it was a financial? So like the idea that the season is a grind in basketball, and especially in January and February, it's just like the doldrums, and you don't even fifth game in 7 nights. You don't even know who you're playing. You can't keep track of it all. We have something like 1,230 games in a regular season. Not that I watch all of them or most of them, but it's a different thing. So I think I think this is important background to answer your question about the charges of homogeneity and sort of like optimization ruining the sport. You've ruined the sport. That's what they say.
Yeah.
I think there's some truth to the overarching idea that optimization can take away the joyful things for certain audience members. I think there's actually a really interesting NPR. I think it's an NPR podcast. Someone sent it to me about this entire concept across multiple sports and how, like, having your lower level English Premier Football League team in soccer be relegated or something is like part of the journey, and you still like going and watching mediocre stuff because it's your local team, and you drink we're drinking the beers. We're back to drinking the beers and eating chips or whatever they like to eat
mashed
while they watch.
Peas. I've seen pictures of mashed peas. I don't know what's going on there, but okay.
Right, pitch side, you just down it while you're watching the game. But like, if you go to optimize and you say, okay, we don't want that because that's not the best, let's get rid of that. Maybe that doesn't sort of support the most joy or the best experience for certain fan types. And I think that trickles all the way up to your question in basketball, where the mid-range is not used as much. The game is more stretched out. There are a lot of three-point shots. And so to some people, the sort of flow and style and feel of an old game goes away, and they like that feel very much. And so literally it's been ruined. The advances of the sport have ruined it. Now, do I think it's been ruined? No, I love a lot of different eras, and part of the beauty of basketball is there's so many different ways to do it. Also, we are in the most efficient offensive time we've ever seen, and I think the strategic arms race we're seeing, and I try to have a decent amount of our coverage of the league reflect this, I think it's the most rapid and interesting strategic arms race we've seen in the entire history of the sport. And that's mind-blowing because the sport was invented in the 1890s by a gym teacher in Canada, became very popular in the United States in the 1930s. The war happened. It kind of fizzled out. They started the NBA at the end of the 40s. It didn't really take off. Thank goodness someone had the idea for the shot clock, because there was like a 19-18 game one day where they were trying to slow down George Mikan. George Mikan was a dominant player at the time, and they just held the ball because there was no shot clock. Long story short, we finally get the sport to take off, and we get to the 80s, and we get dunking and Magic and Bird, and Michael Jordan comes along and is the messiah and makes the sport go international. What were we talking about? I've completely
talking about the NLL. But let me
summer. See, I turn into Bill Walton in the summer. I just start saying, I have
to see that Bill Walton documentary. It's out.
Yes, the 3-point shooting. So I think if you were to simplify the sport again, and you were to go, all anyone does is shoot threes, you're missing, first of all, more than half the shots aren't threes. Secondly, the threes are all kind of created differently. Some threes are based on a post up. Some threes are based on drive and kick. Some threes are in transition. And underneath that, the guts of what's happening, the sausage making, is more interesting than ever to me because of the complexity of the way coaches and players are using their skills and their actions and moving and screening and cutting. And so, in a sense, Kevin, there's actually a convergence of the old styles. The Golden State Warriors, you've mentioned them multiple times. They're fairly popular around the planet. One of their offensive staples is called a split cut. You throw it to the post, maybe a high post, and you have two guys. They run toward each other, and one can screen for the other. You don't know which way the other one's going to go. It's true read and react. It's like an option route for both guys, okay? The Boston Celtics used to have that as part of their offense, as a staple of their offense, when Bill Russell was leading them to championships and passing the ball from the post, from the high post to John Havlicek and Sam Jones and those guys running split cuts. And you'll see those like lineages of play types. You'll go watch an old game and you'll be like, oh, that play looks really familiar. They're using that today. What they've added is the 3-point shot. What they've added is the fact that the center can dribble and play like a point guard and do all this stuff. So I think there's some truth to it, but I think there's a ton more going on, which is why it's so interesting to me.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue with the international player pool expansion that no sport has had a bigger influx, at least of potential talent, right, going in. And you'd assume that a lot of that would be realized. And I guess, yeah, I mean, I would even say, the reason I mention the Warriors sometimes is I was living in New York for a number of years, and like I would see kids wearing Warriors stuff more than any other team. Certainly, so no Knicks, maybe on the outer boroughs or something. There's some Knicks gear going around there, but it became this team, became a team that really pulled in people like that. And I guess I would argue maybe the first Durant finals with the Cavs, what was that, 2018 or something like that? I mean, I was blown away those first few games when I was watching. I was like, this is absolutely incredible basketball that I'm watching right now. So I think I think maybe when people are doing a lesser imitation of that style, that it doesn't translate quite as well. But I have hard time seeing that as not being like the pinnacle almost of what I've seen from a basketball standpoint.
Well, the other part of it is Golden State and that offensive style has influenced the league as the years have gone on, but there still aren't a ton of teams that just truly play that style. And in fact, the darling of this season, the Sacramento Kings, they said, okay, we're going to borrow a little. We had a video on this. We're going to borrow a little from Golden State. Their new coach this season came from Golden State, longtime assistant Mike Brown under Steve Kerr. So they're going to borrow some of that. We're going to borrow a little of how the Nuggets play with Jokic and using him as a facilitator at the high post. We might even borrow a little of the principles from Steve Nash and his Phoenix Suns teams and pushing and trying to play really fast and get into a quick pick and roll. So there are differences in styles around the league. And the irony is Golden State style now doesn't even have them as a leader in 3-point attempts. So it's not even like they're just spamming threes all over the place. They're still, trying to get the layup is always the best shot. You're still just trying to get the layup and everything kind of flows from there. So even within that context, I do think there's stylistic differences when you look at teams and you say, this is a pick and roll heavy team. This is a movement heavy team. This is a team that likes to play through a big man at the high post. This is a team that plays in transition. Sometimes you turn a team on and you're like, this team has no offense. They don't know what they're doing. That's no different than 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you would turn on a game and yes, it was more post-centric and they didn't take as many threes and it was played in the half court or whatever. But it was the same thing. You'd go, okay, the role players are spotting up there to try to hit 15-footers instead of 3-pointers. Some teams run a little bit more pick and roll. The teams back then that had Kobe Bryant, Carmelo Anthony, Paul Pierce, et cetera, they want to run more isolation. They had this idea that isolation, the one-on-one-ness of basketball was the way to go. So I think you see the same things through different generations that you see today. It's just under a microscope today.
Okay, well, let's talk generationally a bit here. And
this is why you brought me on. Kevin, I need everyone to know that we've been talking for an hour and I've been lied to. Kevin said we need to talk about the greatest quarterbacks of all time. And I said, then we need to talk about Autogram, and we haven't made any progress on this. So
Well,
go
I
ahead.
don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want a spoiler alert for good old Otto, where he'll come. Automatic Otto, I think was his name at one point, where he comes out here. Okay, but I was just gonna say, and similar to that, your GOAT series that you did at actually I see it's thinkingbasketball.net,
That's right. We've grown
formerly
up.
Backfix.
We've grown up. Yes,
Formerly Backfix.
it's a little thing called the Backpicks 40. We've called it the
The
Backpicks.
Backpix 40, exactly. Yeah. This is probably the first thing that I've seen of your work. I digested all of the top 40. It's one of the things that I just love looking at this stuff. You have updated it. It looks like the last time on here was in fall of 2022. I'm not sure it has been updated after that. Just quickly give me like the methodology for how you're going to do this, because I do think this is a very useful exercise. Now, you may have actually watched every minute of every one of these players, but my one of my sales points on my statistical thing is that it's impossible to do so. So therefore, looking at stats is better. But you may have actually watched all of these guys. So is that how you did it? You watched them all, and then you just started jotting this down on a piece of paper at the very end after you watched the last second of basketball?
It's taken a lot of years, but finally someone has realized the dream to, yes, that was my secret. I've watched every possession they've ever played. No, stats can see possessions that you can't. Of course, that's the idea here. The method for this, first of all, people ask me like, who do you think is the best player ever? How do you make a GOAT list? I don't know. There's so many different criteria, and it's very fuzzy. It's very complicated. So I wanted something that was more useful, and I started focusing on, let's look at a player and a specific season and figure out how much value he provided within that season. We can get into the nitty gritty of that, but that was the spirit. And then if you do that for multiple seasons, then you can start to sort of add up the career value that a player has in his time. So all we ever really care about is what's going on relative to the league that year. This way you don't have to worry about these crazy time machine arguments and things like that. But it's slightly counterintuitive because it's not based on someone's peak. It's not based on someone's prime. It's not based on the indelible moments and the impressions. It's really just more about the career value, adding up all those seasons within their time. That was the spirit of it, to try to understand the shape of how this player played, how valuable might he have been at his best. When did he have down periods? How do injuries impact his, he goes away for 2 years, someone else is playing for those 2 years. What does it mean? So that was the spirit of the list.
Okay, let's just go ahead. I'm going to run through some of these here.
This is a lot. Do you have the updated version?
I have whatever was as of fall of 2022.
Yes, we did. We did an entire 10-part podcast reboot of that last summer, going through the list and talking about.
I'm going to have to ask you how Magic and Larry Bird flipped rankings when
we had a whole episode.
Last thing I checked, they did not play any. I don't remember them getting out on the court anytime in the last.
No, they didn't. Year. But I have seen them play quite a bit more. To your point. Just going and watching more old games. Yeah.
Oh, right. So I forgot you're digging through this. So by the time your life extending medical care and you can live till 500, you will have gone through this another time here. Okay, let's start at the top. So you already had LeBron James at number one. Presumably that he had a decent year, so I don't think he's going down in that regard. Kareem was at number one before, now at number two. He's probably someone who people do not really put him in that GOAT discussion very often, at least with Michael Jordan at number three. How much of this is just longevity between these three?
That's all longevity. So we did, for the YouTube channel, we did a series about the greatest peaks. And if I had to pick, I'd probably take Jordan as having the greatest peak. But when you look at the longevity that those two guys have, and it's not, by the way, to diminish where they were at their best. I mean, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has the most MVPs of any player who's ever played. He has 6 MVPs. But those guys, Kareem came into the league in the 1969-1970 season. I personally think he was probably a top 10 player when he was at UCLA, but he continued to play in college. And he won finals MVP in his 16th season. 16th season. And he was basically an all-star level player until like his late 30s. LeBron has a similar thing going on where LeBron came into the league 20 years ago, and he's got to be up to about 19 All-Star games at least at this point. And if you look at where they're finishing in MVP voting or All NBA voting as just a very simple proxy of how good they are still, they have like 16, 17-year spans where Jordan broke his leg in 1986, missed most of the season, and then from 1987 to 1998, almost missed 2 more years for baseball, and that's basically his career. So in that sense, that's very much the difference there.
His time with the Wizards did not put him over the top.
The time with the Wizards did not move the needle, Kevin. For some people, it pulled the needle back. It reversed the vehicle. Yeah.
One thing about Kareem, and let's go ahead and throw him in that generally underrated sort of bucket. I think like his time with the Bucks is just a little bit out of the consciousness of most people, and even people who weren't around to see his time with the Lakers. There's still like an awareness of what was going on in the 80s with the Lakers. And I also think, and probably more importantly, like the front half of their 8 finals in 10 years with Magic Johnson there on the Lakers was, more Kareem than Magic, but yet I also think that's kind of lost in most people's impressions.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Especially with Magic's 1980 last game of the season, where he jumps center and has like 42 points and 15 rebounds. It's the best game I've seen of his, and I haven't seen all of them. But it's the best game I've seen of his maybe until like 1983 or 1984. It's just an extraordinary game. The game before, he set the record for turnovers in a finals game. He had like 9 or 10 turnovers. Kareem carried them. And Kareem, that was 1980, was his last MVP season. So he was the guy on that team. And maybe even still in 1982, he was the best player on that team. And they changed trajectories. Kareem's going down as Magic is ascending, but Magic gets the credit for that in a lot of people's minds. And of course, Magic goes back to what we said earlier. Magic's a more charismatic. He's got the PR. He's got the public love going for him. So.
Yeah, and Kareem, low-key, kind of a dick, I guess. I mean, that seems to be
that's how he was portrayed.
I know he was very erudite, and he's reading books, and and kind of a dick at the same time. But okay, how about if Magic Johnson doesn't take the baby hook in '87 and instead dumps it into Kareem, which was supposed to be the play, which he glances at and just is like, no, I'm just going to hook it over 2 players instead of throw it to Kareem wide open in the post there. Maybe we'd all be thinking about it a little bit differently also.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
I like that he stops for a fraction of a second and is like, no, I'm not. I'm just going to go ahead and shoot this eventually. But hey, when it goes in, it goes in. And then Bird misses the 3 right after that. Another key point right there.
He's still mad about missing that 3. Yeah, he's still mad about missing that 3. All right. Okay, what's next? Is it Sammy Baugh time? What are we?
No, we're still in the NBA here. Okay. Okay, you have Shaq at number 5. I think that's another one where people wouldn't have it in their memory. I mean, you have Russell here at number 4, and I would say that like people probably don't have an appreciation for Russell, but at the same time, there are enough brain dead like rings or all that matters arguments out there that some people will throw him into a top player, and then you're like, why? And they're like, I really don't know. I have no idea why, but he has all these rings. So I really feel like that's more controversial, Shaq at 5 than Russell at 4, even if most people couldn't really tell you why Russell belongs at 4 other than rings.
Shaq has this reputation of throwing away a number of years for lack of conditioning and, only really actualizing for a few seasons with Phil Jackson and on and on and on. But go back to longevity over time, like functional longevity over time. He was really good as a rookie in 1993. He was elite immediately after that. 1994, pretty much until the time he left the Lakers around then. So that's like 11 more years. And then he's got at least a season or 2 in Miami. Again, the totality of this over like 13 seasons with a tremendous peak in my estimation. And those years are just all kind of lost in the shuffle. He goes to Los Angeles, they get swept. There's a lot of the Lakers. Why are we worried about Shaq? He's not that good. And it's like, well, it's a team sport. And if you actually start to look at how good this guy's been, I think losing in the finals in 1995 to Olajuwon and being swept in that series, and then not really coming back into the consciousness until 2000 with Phil Jackson in Los Angeles and Kobe and Shaq win their first title. I think this kind of removes in a lot of people's minds just how good those years were. But for me, it's the totality again of that like 10, 11, 12, 13 year stretch. And it's hard to, when you start stacking up players, it's hard to match that historically.
Why do you think it is that I mean, as being someone who grew up in Southern California, there was like always there's a bias, especially later on in Shaq's career towards Kobe than towards Shaq. I mean, we talked about kind of like the Kareem versus Magic. Like, not only was Kobe the second fiddle to Shaq, it was like distant by a big margin along the way for when they were really making those first few championship runs. But fans kind of preferred and would rather have seen him go than not. You could argue that even in Orlando, some of the tension maybe with Penny Hardaway was part of the reason why he was willing to leave there. So what is it about Shaq that maybe people just don't instinctually appreciate? Which is weird because he's such an incredibly, I mean, I've never seen anything like it. I used to watch all the Lakers games back then. I've never even seen anything like it, even on defense or when he would jump into a passing lane every now and again. I've just never seen anyone physically be like that before in my life.
I think he's somewhat understood or appreciated for sort of his peak. I do think the big thing with him is the longevity and to some degree the injuries. So another part of the method is looking at how much you impact the odds of your team winning within a particular season. It turns out like missing 10 or 20 regular season games isn't a big deal in that, as long as you're healthy for the playoffs, which is exactly what happened to Shaq in like almost every one of these years. But in the culture, Kevin, a lot of people are huge on like, oh, he only played 62 games that year. It's terrible. He's giving up all this value. He's injured all the time, et cetera,
right.
et cetera.
And he doesn't stack maybe a couple of more MVPs when he was the best player in the NBA.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. There's this idea of how does he only have one MVP? It's exactly in line with what I'm talking about. So, I have to go at some point. Are we going to discuss these?
All right. How much time do we have here? I got a couple more, and then we'll do a follow-up podcast for.
Okay. Let's say 7 minutes.
Okay, 7 minutes here. You did an entire podcast series on this. I'm going to compact it into 7 minutes here. Okay.
See, I just want everyone to realize what he just said. He has completely pulled the rug out. We're not going to get to have the Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Peyton Manning. Who else is in that list for you? Otto Graham. Where are you?
You haven't watched football in a decade.
Are you a big Dan Marino fan?
Of course.
Joe Montana. Should probably mention him.
Other guys that I want to mention, because I think this might have been the big one that actually initially hooked me into your series, is Wilt Chamberlain at number 8. Yes. And because I've had people say, well, Wilt Chamberlain has to be in consideration for the GOAT of all time. Just give me the elevator pitch on what's missing in that discussion, if not all the things that we talked about as far as on ball, all that sort of stuff.
I think he's underrated defensively, probably overrated offensively because of what we talked about earlier, looking at the box score, points per game. His offense was, when he was younger, more, I don't want to say one-dimensional, but there wasn't the same playmaking or passing component that we see in the great offensive players today. One of my favorite stats ever is the season he averaged 50 points per game. Very famous season. He also averaged 2 assists per game. That would be 25 points for every assist. No one is close in NBA history to that rate of scoring versus passing. So I think that's the short of it. He is also in many ways the most interesting player probably ever to talk about. And there's a lot of ebbs and flows and changes in his career, which is why I've written a lot about Wilt and made content on him before, but we will have another Wilt video coming up soon, Kevin. It's in the works. And also there's a documentary coming out on Wilt that I am part of, which will be out in July.
Wow, moving on up, moving on up. Was Wilt just trolling when he decided he was going to like try to lead the NBA in assists eventually after having scored all those points? That seems weird to me. I feel like there's a negative component to that where a player just decides, you know what, I'm just going to do something that you don't expect.
I think he went a little too far. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know if
yeah,
I'd call it trolling, but I think he went a little too far. Yeah.
yeah. They maybe invented the trolling there. Okay, a couple of other guys that we need to talk about. I guess we talked a little bit about Curry already. Where can we see him peaking out? And can he catch Kobe? I'd say would be my favorite because Kobe is one of those ones where he probably falls on the other end of the spectrum as far as people appreciating or over appreciating on ball scoring and underestimating the value of someone like Curry.
Yeah, I think he could. I mean, at this point, it's very much a longevity game based on that method and that list because the tricky part for Curry is he was both better earlier than people give him credit for. Because it's like, oh, he came out of nowhere in 2015 and he won MVP. But the flip side is he also didn't really hit that level until he was a little bit older, until it was his fourth season, fifth season. And he's playing in a time where the normal player today, might play 15 years when in the 60s or 70s, a normal good player might play 10 or 11 years. So getting your in-era dominance, your in-era longevity, really, in his case, requires him to continue to have these good seasons. He missed the 2012 season, essentially, because of an ankle injury. He missed the 2020 season because of a broken hand. So it's much like Jordan. You start to pull off seasons from your prime off the board. In order to catch some of the other guys, you need to keep going. He needs to continue to have more good seasons. But, I think it could definitely happen. Yeah.
Okay, one last guy here. And that is probably the lowest or highest if you divide their ranking by MVPs won and Moses Malone. Tell me why he is at, let me get the updated number, 27 here between Rick Barry and Scottie Pippen, despite having won the MVP award 3 times, which I guess has him tied for 4th most. Well, not 4th most because there's 2 here. So tied for 6th most winning the award.
Yeah. I don't like those MVPs. I am not a fan of those MVPs.
Is rebounding a bad stat?
Well, today I think it's overstated. I don't know if I would call it a bad stat, but it goes back to one of your earlier questions about like if you had someone come in and watch the sport, what would they track? Would Kareem's off the basket today be like super important to track? Not quite as much as they've traditionally been thought of as I think. It's not that necessarily with Moses. It's just I evaluate how good I think someone is as a player independent of their accolades. And I'm not saying I would never have voted him for MVP. One, we talk about that on the podcast all the time. It's a very difficult thing to figure out what it even means to be MVP. So I don't want to say I would never have voted him at a certain point MVP. But his 3 years he won MVP are historically weak. They're sort of traditional. They're very, very atypical. I mean, I think 1 year his team was under 500, which is just unheard of in the modern game to win MVP on like a 39 and 43 team or whatever it was. He wasn't much like what we talked about with Wilt. Wilt was a better passer than he was and a better playmaker. Moses, the cool thing about Moses back then is he's like, I'm going to go hang out under the basket and just clean up your misses. So the offensive rebounding, I think, had a lot of value. The rest of his offensive game, I'm not sure about. His defensive game, it's okay. Big men sometimes, some of the great big men on that list are some of the best defenders ever. There's a lot of data that suggests we historically underrate defense and that these guys really do move the needle. Moses is okay there. So on one hand, you get in these conversations and you think lower of someone and you go, okay, are you saying the guy's not an all-star? No, I'm not saying the guy's not an all-star. I'm saying he's one of the 30 greatest players ever. But to your point, traditionally, people go, oh, Moses has 3 MVPs. That's a lot. He was on this great team in 1983 with the 76ers. He led one of the greatest teams of all time in 1983 with the 76ers. And it's like, people forget the part where the Sixers made the finals in 1982 without him. And they also made the finals in 1980 without him, although the team was a little different then. That 83 Sixers team was so stacked to me. Like, I think you could argue there were 5 All-Stars on that team. It was super, super stacked. So that's the 90-second version of why I'm a little lower on him. And then the last part is the longevity. He was a player who came in very young and has all these games played after 1983, but I think he only has like 1 or 2 more good years. There were some questions about his conditioning or whether he was riffing with the coach in Philadelphia. The team goes up and down. Some of his numbers go up and down. Then he gets traded. And it's like, then you hit me watching live games every night. And it's like, did going to the arena and watching Bullets Moses Malone, like Atlanta Hawks Moses Malone, did that like really move the needle that much? Not too much for me.
All right. Well, we did it, folks. We wrapped up the entire thing in 7 minutes there. No need to listen to.
Yes, we made it through the show that Kevin wanted to have me come on and talk about all-time quarterbacks without mentioning any of the quarterbacks. We accomplished the goal.
We'll get to that. Part 2 will be on the way. Ben, thanks so much for joining me. I don't know if you really have to plug anything, but obviously the YouTube, like I said, it's just blown up. I believe you're in partnership with the NBA. I don't know what's going on there. You're now a documentarian, filmmaker. Everything's going well for you now. The red carpet is in your future. So congrats. I follow Ben on Twitter, LG35. Is that like a remnant of old listserv posting days or something? Or
that's exactly what it is. It's an old remnant, and it's also designed so people don't harass me as much on Twitter. That's all Twitter is good for, Kevin, is harassment.
We call that constructive feedback, I think, on there. Okay. All right, but thanks so much for joining me. Hopefully everyone enjoyed this. I'll have links to everything in the show notes, and otherwise, I'll be talking at you guys next week. Thanks.